Somewhere on the Anzio beachhead, in the cold spring of 1944, a German officer sat in the dark and wrote a few lines in a diary he never meant for anyone to read. He was not writing propaganda. He was not writing for a newspaper or a commander or for history. He was writing for himself in the way frightened men have always written for themselves, quietly, privately, trying to give a shape to something they could not understand. And what he wrote was this: "The black devils are all around us every time we come into the line, and we never hear them come." Think about that sentence for a moment, not the words themselves, but the man behind them. This was a soldier of the Wehrmacht, one of the most professional fighting forces the world had ever produced. He had been trained to hold ground, to read a battlefield, to keep his fear in a locked room somewhere behind his eyes. He was not a boy. He was not new to the war. And yet, alone in the darkness, he reached past all of his training and all of his discipline, and he wrote the word devils, not the enemy, not the Americans, not the commandos. Devils. There is a particular kind of honesty that only comes out in a diary. A man will lie to his officers. He will lie in his letters home to spare his mother. He will even lie to himself in the daylight. But in the dark, with a pencil, writing something no one is ever supposed to see, that is where the truth lives. And the truth this officer left behind was that somewhere out there in the black Italian night, something was hunting him, something he could not see, could not hear, and could not stop. This is not a Hollywood story. It would be easy to make it one. It would be easy to reach for the swelling music and the square-jawed heroes and the tidy speeches before the battle. But the men this German officer was so afraid of did not think of themselves as heroes, and most of them never spoke of what they did, not for the rest of their lives. What they left behind was quieter than a legend and heavier than one. They left behind a name, given to them not by their own country, not by their own generals, but by the enemy who feared them. Die Schwarzen Teufel, the Black Devils. And the real question, the one worth the next 20 minutes of your evening, is not whether they were brave. Brave men were everywhere in that war, on every side, in numbers too great to count. Bravery, in the end, is common. It is one of the most common things in the world. The question is stranger and more difficult than that. How does a single unit, out of the millions of men under arms in the Second World War, earn a name from the very people trying to kill them? What did these men actually do night after night to reach inside a hardened German soldier and leave behind a word like devils? And where, in the name of God, did such men even come from? To answer that, we have to go back, not to Italy and not to the war at all, but to a cold, empty stretch of Montana, 2 years before that officer ever picked up his pencil. In the summer of 1942, in the mountains near Helena, at a place called Fort William Henry Harrison, a new kind of unit was quietly being built. It had a bland, forgettable name, chosen on purpose: the 1st Special Service Force. It sounded like something that sorted the mail or ran a supply depot. That was exactly the point. What it actually was something the world had never quite seen before. It was a joint force, American and Canadian, the two nations mixed together in the same companies, wearing the same insignia, answering to the same officers. Men from Alberta standing shoulder to shoulder with men from Alabama, sleeping in the same tents, eating from the same pots. In an age of fierce and jealous national pride, that alone was almost unthinkable. There was no American regiment and no Canadian regiment. There was only the force. They were, from the first day, something in between, belonging fully to no country and so belonging only to each other. And the mission they were built for was close to madness. It was called Project Plow. The plan was to drop these men into Nazi-occupied Norway in the dead of winter, to fight through the snow and the mountains and destroy the hydroelectric plants that fed the German war machine. And then to keep going, to melt into the frozen wilderness and wage a private, endless war behind enemy lines, cut off, alone, with no way home and no expectation of return. It was, if we are honest about it, a suicide mission dressed up as a strategy. And to carry it out, the army did not want ordinary soldiers, Ordinary soldiers would not do. They needed a different kind of animal entirely. So the call went out for a very particular kind of man. Lumberjacks, forest rangers, hunters, trappers, prospectors, game wardens, north woodsmen. Men who already knew how to live in the cold and the dark and the empty places. Men who were comfortable being alone with a rifle and a knife and their own thoughts for days, for weeks, with no one to talk to but the wind. Men who, in more than a few cases, had come to the army with a rough edge that the other units did not much want. Troublemakers, loners, hard cases. They were not gathered because they were polished. They were gathered because they were durable, because they had already been broken by hard country and had not broken all the way. And then Montana went to work on them and made them harder still. The training that followed was, by the standards of the time, close to cruel. They learned to ski and to climb, to move up sheer rock faces and across glaciers with weapons in packs on their backs, in the kind of cold that kills men who make one careless mistake. They were taught demolitions, how to bring down a bridge or gut a power station with the right charge in the right place. They learned to jump out of aircraft, most of them for the first time in their lives, and to do it at night. They learned amphibious landings, coming ashore from small boats in the dark. And they learned to kill up close, silently, with their hands and with a blade, a special fighting knife designed for the force and for no one else, a long, thin stiletto meant for a single purpose, which was to end a man before he could make a sound. They marched until their feet bled, and then they marched further. They went without sleep, deliberately, for days, so that they would learn what their own minds did when sleep was taken away. They went without food, so that they would learn the same about their bodies. They were pushed, on purpose and without mercy, past the place where an ordinary man breaks, and then a little further past it, so that when the real breaking came, in the real war, they would already be familiar with the far side of it. They would already know that a man can keep moving after the point where he is certain he cannot. By the end of it, they were not really soldiers in the way the word is usually meant. They were something narrower and colder and sharper. They were a scalpel, forged at enormous cost and care for one single impossible cut. And then, as so often happens in war, the cut was called off. Project Plough was abandoned. The invasion of Norway never came. The plan that had justified all of it, all the training and the misery and the assembling of these particular men, quietly evaporated. And so the finest raiding force the two nations could produce found itself holding a rare and terrible skill set with absolutely nowhere to use it, a loaded weapon with no target, waiting. Their first taste of combat, when it finally came, was almost an insult. In the summer of 1943, they were sent north to the Aleutian Islands, to the fog-bound rock of Kiska, where the Japanese had dug in. The force went ashore, braced for slaughter, every man ready for the fight they had trained 2 years to have, and they found the island empty. The Japanese had already slipped away in the fog days before, ghosts leaving before the other ghosts arrived. All that preparation, all that coiled ferocity, and their first battle was a battle against no one, against gray water and freezing wind and their own held breath with nothing to spend it on. Some of the worst casualties they took on Kiska came from confusion and friendly fire and the cruelty of the weather itself. It was not the war they had been promised, but their war was coming. It was waiting for them in the mountains of Italy, and it would ask everything of them. By the autumn of 1943, the Allied advance up the long spine of Italy had ground to a halt. The Germans had built a defensive line across the mountains, the Winter Line, and it was holding beautifully, murderously. At the heart of it stood a mountain called Monte la Defensa, a wall of rock rising some 3,000 feet into the freezing sky, with a German Panzer Grenadier division dug into its heights, looking down on everything that moved in the valleys below. Whoever held that mountain controlled the road to Rome, and the Germans held it. The Allies had already thrown themselves against it and been thrown back. The 3rd Infantry Division had tried for 10 long days. Good men, veteran men, men who knew their business, died on those slopes, and the mountain did not move. The casualty lists grew, and the front did not advance a single mile. Eventually, the whole offensive was simply called off. La Defensa was, in the cool language of the planners, impregnable. It could not be taken. It had been decided. So they gave it to the men from Montana. On the night of the 1st of December, having arrived in Italy only a couple of weeks before, the 1st Special Service Force moved to the base of the mountain in the dark, and instead of attacking where the Germans expected them, up the accessible slopes, straight into the guns, the way brave men had already tried and died, they did something the enemy had decided was impossible and had therefore stopped guarding. They climbed the cliff. In the darkness, in the cold, hand over hand, up a near vertical rock face on the mountain's flank, hundreds of men hauled themselves and their rifles and their ammunition to the summit. A face so steep and so exposed that the German defenders had left it almost unwatched, precisely because no sane force would ever try it. They had trained for exactly this in the mountains of Montana without knowing it. And now, in the black hours before dawn, the training paid its debt. When the Germans on top of that mountain finally understood what was happening, when they realized that the enemy had not come up the path, but had come up the wall itself, out of the empty night, out of nowhere. The fight was already half lost. The Fifth Army planners had estimated that breaking Monte la Defensa, if it could be broken at all, would take up to 5 days of hard fighting. The force took the summit in roughly 2 hours. But the mountain took its price, the way mountains always do. The battle for the peak and the grinding fight to hold it against everything the Germans threw back and the push on to the next height beyond, all of it in freezing rain and sleet, on bare rock, with the wounded impossible to evacuate down that same terrible slope, cost the force dearly. In the taking of La Defensa and its neighbor alone, the force counted its dead and its shattered, dozens killed, hundreds wounded, more men lost to the weather and the exhaustion and the sheer inhuman cold than a peacetime mind can easily hold. And that was only the beginning of the mountain campaign, because after La Defensa came the next peak, and after that one the next, La Remetanea, Simucro, taken in the snow on Christmas Day, Maggio, ridge after frozen ridge, each one defended, each one paid for in the same coin. And by the time that winter in the Italian mountains was over, the 1st Special Service Force had suffered casualties running as high as 77%. 77%. Sit with that number for a moment, because it is easy to read and impossible to feel. Out of every 100 men who had trained together in the snow of Montana, who had learned each other's names and jokes and the names of each other's wives and hometowns, 77 would be dead or wounded or simply gone. The scalpel was cutting exactly as it had been forged to cut, and it was being worn down in the cutting to almost nothing. Word of what they had done reached the very top of the war. When the news of the impossible thing on La Defensa made its way to the highest commanders, they spoke of the force and its commander, Colonel Robert Frederick, in the language usually reserved for legends, a quiet army officer whom Churchill himself would praise in almost extravagant terms, one of a small handful of men, it was said, who could have won the war years early if there had only been more like him. But the men of the force had little time and less inclination to feel like legends. They were too busy surviving, and their hardest test was still in front of them. Waiting on a flat, exposed, God-forsaken stretch of coastline called Anzio. Anzio was a trap disguised as a triumph. The Allies had landed there behind the German lines, hoping to unlock the whole Italian front in one bold stroke, and had instead found themselves pinned against the sea, penned into a shallow beachhead ringed by German artillery on the high ground, unable to break out and unable to leave. It became a place of mud and endless shell fire and slow, patient attrition, where every square yard was watched, where every movement in daylight drew fire, where men lived like animals in flooded holes in the ground for months on end. And into this, in the early days of February 1944, went the 1st Special Service Force, already battered from the mountains, already understrength, missing something close to half of the men it had started with. They were handed a stretch of the perimeter to hold, and by every ordinary military measure, they simply did not have enough men to hold it. A line of many kilometers, meant for a full division, given to a fraction of a brigade. So they did not defend it the way anyone expected them to. They did something far stranger and far more terrible. They took the darkness itself, the very thing that frightened other men, and they turned it into a weapon that belonged to them alone. Every single night, small patrols would slip out of the Allied lines and into the black ground between the two armies, and then beyond it, past the German wire, into the enemy positions themselves. They smeared their faces with black boot polish until in the darkness they became nothing at all. An absence, a smudge, a shadow carrying a knife. They moved without sound, the way they had learned to move in the empty forests and mountains of home, where a snapped twig means a lost hunt. And they went in among the German soldiers as they slept in their holes, as they stood their lonely sentry watches, as they whispered to one another, believing themselves safe behind their own lines. And they killed silently with the blade, and were gone again into the dark before any alarm could be raised. And here is the single detail that turns a raid into a haunting. On the bodies of the men they killed, and on the walls of the bunkers they slipped through, they left a calling card. A small sticker bearing the spearhead insignia of the force, and beneath it a line printed carefully in German so that the enemy would understand it perfectly, with no translation needed. Das dicke Ende kommt noch. The worst is yet to come. Now truly imagine it. Imagine being a young German soldier on that line. Imagine waking in the thin gray light of morning to find the man beside you dead. Killed without a single sound in the night, his throat opened and pinned to his coat a small paper note, printed in your own language, calmly promising you that this, all of this, was only the beginning. Imagine understanding in that moment that the men who did it had crouched over your sleeping comrade, close enough to reach out and touch you as well, and had chosen to leave you alive to find him. Imagine that you never once heard them come and never once heard them go. And now, imagine that happening not for one night, but night after night, week after week, for months, until sleep itself became a kind of terror, and the darkness became a living thing with a will of its own. The Germans, it is said, pulled their lines back, physically gave up hard-won ground, moved their positions rearward, for no reason other than to put a little more distance between themselves and those patrols. Think about what that means. They were not retreating from an army. They were not driven off by tanks or overwhelmed by numbers. They were retreating from a feeling, from the certainty that the dark did not belong to them anymore. The force held that impossible line at Anzio for 99 days without relief. 99 days, more than 3 months, under strength, outnumbered, doing the work of a full division with the men of a battered brigade. And in all that time, the ground they held did not fall. And it was here, in this long agony of the Anzio nights, that the name was finally born. Somewhere out on that beachhead, on the body of a dead German officer, the force found the diary. And in it, in the cramped private handwriting of a frightened professional soldier writing for no eyes but his own, was the sentence that would follow these men through the rest of history. The black devils are all around us every time we come into the line, and we never hear them come. The enemy had a name for them now, Die Schwarzen Teufel. And understand what kind of a name that is. It was not chosen by the force for itself. It was not printed on a recruiting poster or shouted across a parade ground or dreamed up by some clever officer in a public relations office. It rose up, unbidden, out of the enemy's own fear, in the enemy's own language, written in the enemy's own trembling hand, which makes it the highest and strangest honor a fighting man can ever receive, because it is the one honor in all the world that cannot be faked or bought or awarded. Your own side can call you brave. They are supposed to. Your friends can call you a hero, but only your enemy can look at you across the dark and call you a devil, and mean it with his whole shaking heart. If you have stayed with this story all the way to here, then you already understand why it is worth telling. These men left almost nothing behind of their own. No grand memoirs, no victory parades under their own name, no monuments in the town square. What they left behind was a handful of diaries written by the very people they terrified, and a name they never asked for and rarely spoke. Stories like theirs do not survive on their own. They survive only when someone chooses, deliberately, to carry them forward into the light. So if you want the next forgotten name to find its way to you, the next unit, the next impossible night, the next man history nearly lost, then stay with us here and subscribe. Not for us, for them, so that the men who moved through the dark are not in the end swallowed by it. Because the story does not stop at Anzio. When the beachhead finally broke open in the summer of 1944 and the Allied armies surged out at last, the 1st Special Service Force was among the very first Allied units to enter the city of Rome, racing ahead to seize the bridges over the Tiber before the retreating Germans could blow them into the river. Their commander, Colonel Frederick, was wounded 3 separate times in that single day of fighting for the city, and 3 separate times he refused to leave his men. From Rome, they went on again into the south of France, storming ashore onto rocky islands in the Mediterranean in the dark, leading the way once more, always at the tip of the spear, always sent to the places other men could not go. And then, at the end of 1944, in a quiet field in southern France, it ended. Not with a battle, but with a signature. The 1st Special Service Force was simply disbanded. The unit was broken up, dissolved, its surviving men parceled out into other formations. American paratroopers, American Rangers, Canadian units bound for home. There was no farewell remotely worthy of what these men had done together, no final ceremony that could hold the weight of it. The force that the enemy had feared as devils was quietly folded away, its files closed, its flag furled, its name retired to the archives. The men who had climbed the impossible cliff and walked into the German lines and left their little notes upon the dead shook hands and went their separate ways and mostly never spoke of any of it again. But names like that do not really die. They only go quiet for a while. Because the men who trained in the snow of Montana, who scaled the wall of La Defensa in the dark, who blackened their faces and walked among their sleeping enemies and left the worst is yet to come pinned to the dead, they became the seed of nearly everything that came after them. The special forces of 2 proud nations trace their bloodline directly back to that strange, cold, half-forgotten experiment near Helena. The Green Berets, the elite raiders, the quiet professionals of a later age, every modern soldier who moves in the dark, who climbs where no one is meant to climb, who trusts a knife and a shadow and his own trained hardness, is, in some real and unbroken way, a descendant of the Black Devils. The scalpel was worn away, but the pattern of it survived and was forged again and again, and is being forged still. Which brings us back, one final time, to that German officer, alone in the dark on the Anzio beachhead, writing the truest thing he ever wrote. He was right to be afraid. The Black Devils really were all around him. He really never did hear them come. And though he could not possibly have known it, sitting there with his pencil and his fear, the thing he dreaded so completely that the only word he could find for it was devil. That thing would outlive him and outlive the war and go on walking through the darkness long after both armies had crumbled into dust and both flags had faded into the pages of history books. He wrote those words to no one, in a diary meant for no one, on a night he surely believed the world would never remember. And here we are, 80 years later, in the quiet, still reading them.